Chapter 2. I could see the crown of the horse chestnut tree, green and sleepy in the thickening sunlight, from my chair near the tall windows of the lounge, not the branch scored by the robe, nor the bosky patch below, where they sipped Nicky into his plastic shroud, just the dense green cumulus of the big old tree would climb in and knocked conkers from, and swung beneath in headless childhood days. My gaze rested on it with my memory, while in the present metal chinked on metal as the pink and gold marquee slowly came down, and Detective Sergeant Collins laboriously checked the facts one more time. We're sure it is Nicholas Lanyon, are we? Our certainty on the point, given that we admitted he'd been beyond our ken for more than 30 years, clearly puzzled him. Mrs. Rutherford. Yes, said Pam. I haven't actually. The dead man is Nicky Lanyon, I put in. You can take my word for it. For the moment, we have to, sir. He didn't seem to be carrying any identification. In fact, he didn't seem to be carrying anything at all. No money? Less than £2 in loose change. What did I say? Remarked Trevor gloomily. Down and out. There's your motive, I suppose. But why come here, sir? That's what I don't understand. You said his family left Truro years ago. 34 years ago, I softly specified. If he was planning to kill himself, coming back here to do it makes perfect sense. Chris, pleaded Pam, do we really need to bother the sergeant with all that? I should think he'd want to be forewarned of the interest the press will take in this. Minimal, I guess, sir. Suicide's not murder, Sergeant. That's why they'll be interested. Nicky Cannonier's father and another man murdered the owner of his house in 1947. Collins frowned. In that case, you're probably right. Hanged, were they? Nicky's father was enough to start the crime correspondence rooting through the archives, do you think? More than likely, sir. Any idea at all about next of kin? Nicky said that his mother was dead. Any brothers or sisters? None living. Anybody in Truro who might still have been in touch with him? Not that I can think of. Hold on, said Pam. Wasn't there an aunt? Yes, I responded, amazed for a moment at how easily and completely I'd forgotten. Nicky's mother had a sister who married into a farming family down on the Roselands, the Jagos. He used to spend a week with them every summer. I went with him one year. Then you know when we can find them. Then you know where we can find them. Yes, my eyes focused on those horse chestnut trees again, I know. Detective Sergeant Collins looked as if he hadn't even been born in 1947. No wonder the name Lanyon meant nothing to him. It was so long ago, but not as long ago as the start of it all. You had to go back much further for that, to the tune of the century and beyond, to a time when Truro Cathedral was only half built, a scaffolded giant slowly taking shape in the heart of the city. It would eventually tower over, an elegant cuckoo swirling and soaring in a nest of Methodism. There was a framed photograph of the west front of the cathedral circa 1900 hanging in the hotel bar. It showed the western half of the building as no more than a shell, with the stonemasons and surveyors pausing in their toil to gaze down from their lofty platforms at the camera. My great-grandfather, Amos Carnaworth, wasn't one of them. I knew that for a fact, despite stonemasonry having been his craft and the cathedral his last place of work. I knew because he died in a fall from scaffolding at the other end of the cathedral back in the spring of 1887. His son Joshua was 14 years old then. His daughter Adelaide, my grandmother, was 8. She told me once that her grandmother claimed the tragedy was God's judgment on a Methodist daring to turn his hand to Anglican granite. Those were the good old days. Great-grandfather's death meant a move from the family home in Old Bridge Street. Gran and Uncle Joshua had grown up there, next to the stables of the Red Lion Hotel, a mere drove's throw from the cathedral in air tinged with dung, harness oil, and granite dust. They found cheaper lodgings in Tabernacle Street, just off Lemon Quay, where mudfish and sailcloths were the prevailing scent. The past is always closer than you think. The Red Lion was finished off by a runaway lorry in the late 60s, and the river flowing past Lemon Quay was covered over in the 20s. I only ever remember the triangular space between Lemon and Black Keys as a car park, with the cathedral looming to the north as a complete and permanent edifice. But somehow I also seem to remember what my grandmother remembered, a different, darker, sweeter Truro 6 hours from London by the fastest train, but in many ways as remote as Constantinople. Uncle Joshua became the family breadwinner after his father's death, labouring in a tin mine out at Baltu 12 hours a day. Gran used to take a freshly cooked pasty out to him for his lunch, wrapped in a cloth to keep it warm. 3 miles there and 3 miles back, there must have been loiter between them then, a trusting tenderness, and no reason in this world to think it wouldn't last their lifetime. Their mother's health, mental as well as physical, declined, but they held their life as a family together. Gran left school at 14 despite her academic promise, and she often later lamented maybe if her father had still been alive, it might have been different, but with her mother no longer even up to taking washing, there was a living to be earned. She took a job as a seamstress cum sales assistant at Webb's Drapery Store in Boscawen Street. Another assistant of her own age, Cordelia Angwin, struck up a friendship with her and became a regular visitor to the house in Tabernacle Street. Cordelia was an energetic and vivacious girl, rapidly blossoming into a beauty. At first, Uncle Joshua paid her little heed, but then, as time passed and she grew older and more composed and more beautiful, Uncle Joshua never told me of this, and Gran was never an entirely reliable chronicler of events involving herself, so a lot had to be guesswork. Deduction, I prefer to call it. Joshua Carnaworth, when I knew him, was a taciturn and watchful man, seemingly incapable of grand romantic gestures. But things were different then, and so was he. He fell hopelessly in love with Cordelia Angwin and pleaded with her to marry him, but she wanted to wait and preferably find a husband capable of elevating her in society, which no mere Tina was likely to be able to do. The rift between Gran and Uncle Joshua dates from this period. Reading her character as well as I can, I should think she was at first embarrassed by his pursuit of her friend, then angry at both of them when she realized just how deeply he adored her. Neither was behaving as she wished, something she never could abide. Matters came to a head in the summer of 1897. Cordelia was 18 and had made it clear to Uncle Joshua that she wouldn't even consider marrying him until she was 21. The implication, I suppose, was that she thought a better choice of husband might cross her path by then. Uncle Joshua must have reckoned that gave him 3 years to transform himself into an irresistible catch. News had just seeped out of a big gold strike in the Canadian Yukon the previous year. The word reached the tin mining community via the dockside tavern of Falmouth. Was that where there were fortunes to be made by those with the right skills? Uncle Joshua was offered a cheap passage on a cargo vessel bound for Nova Scotia. He took it, reckoning he could work his way across to the west coast and reach the Yukon by spring. He extracted some sort of parting promise from Cordelia to wait for him, promising in return that he'll be back before the 3 years were up. Pockets bulging with gold dust, Gran regarded this as an unforgivable betrayal, since it left her to support the ailing mother alone. She thought that if there was any rich pickings to be had in the Yukon, there'd be none left by the time her brother got there. It was a realistic assessment, but young love and realism are mutually exclusive. Uncle Joshua went off to chase his dream. A few letters reached Gran and Cordelia in the course of the winter and spring, reporting his progress across Canada. Then nothing, no news, no word, no contact of any kind. Joshua Carnaworth vanished from sight, and eventually, as the years passed for mine, dead or too ashamed to come home and admit his failure. Nobody knew that which, but either way, he did return in 3 years, or 6, was 12 or 20, back in Truro. Gran started going out with a young man named Cyril Napier. No hopeless love match for her. My grandfather was chosen as just the sort of level-headed but ambitious young man she needed as a companion in life. His parents were originally from Worcester. They moved to Cornwall some years before and opened a grocery shop in River Street. His father was poor in health and had hoped the milder Cornish air would agree with him. It may have done so, but only to a point. He died shortly after Gran and Grandad got engaged. They brought forward the wedding so as to be able to take over the running of the shop as a married couple and move into the Napier home in Carclew Street, with both mothers to save money. Granddad's mother helped in the shop, of course, which meant they didn't have to employ anyone. It was hard work, trading from 7 in the morning to 8 at night, 6 days a week, but it was their own business, and Carclew Street was a little higher up the hill, both topography and socially. My father's birth in 1905 meant they were working to improve the lot of the next generation as well. Gran was setting out her store for the future, so in a sense was Cordelia Angwin. She left Webb's and went into service as a big house in the Falmouth Road. She waited for Uncle Joshua, or better proposition, depending how cynical you want to be, until she was 21 and well beyond. She and Gran had lost touch, although they must have bumped into one another from time to time. Turo's too small a city for them not to have what they said or thought on such occasions, I don't know. About 10 years after Uncle Joshua's departure from the Canadian unknown, Cordelia married. Her husband worked as a junior clerk for the city council. His name was Archie Lanyon. They moved into a small house in St. Austell Street, where their first and only child was born in 1910. They christened him Michael. The cathedral was finished the same year, and the stonemason had to look elsewhere for work. Detective Sergeant Collins was long gone, and most of the caterers clearing up crew likewise. I stood on the lawn watching the men from the Marquis High Company stowing the last of the gear into a lorry parked halfway down this drive. The afternoon was still and sultry, the sunlight warm on my face. Some small creature was rooting through the leaf litter beneath the tree beyond the flower borders, with very little effort of the imagination. The discovery I made that morning could have been consigned to the realm of delusion, but its consequence couldn't be ignored. They were still queuing up to remind me of the reality of Nicky's crooked, lolling head, his chin crusty with dried spittle, and his tongue swollen and protruding, his eyes dead and staring straight at me. "Chris!" I heard Pam call to me from the house, and turning to see her walking down to join me, dragging the set of keys in hand. "Are you alright?" "Yes, I think so. I'm going to drive down and let Mum and Dad know what's happened. Better than a phone call, I thought. Good idea. Do you want to come?" "No, thanks. I have somewhere else to go." I smiled uneasily. "Yes, I probably will take a drive while you're gone to see the Jagos. It seems you've read my mind. I reckon it was either that or you head straight back to Pangbourne." "No, I think I'll probably stay for a few days, if that's all right." "No problem. Of course, if you need the room." I said there was no problem. "Yes, so you did. Thanks. Chris, there's something you should know about the Jagos. They had a son, didn't they?" "Yes, Tommy, a few years ago. A few years younger than Nicky and Nick. He died a while back. I read about it in the paper. A farming accident. A tractor rolled over on him. I think something like that." I glanced away. "Oh, great. That's just great. I was going to mention it to you, but by the time we next heard from you, I must have forgotten." "Never mind." I put my arms around her in a fleeting gesture of brotherly affection. "Tell Mum and Dad I'm really sorry if this has spoiled their anniversary. It's not your fault," she sighed. "At least it didn't happen the night before." "It couldn't have." She frowned at me. "Why not?" "Because I wasn't here then. That's why it is partly my fault. He was waiting for me. He wanted me to be here when he did it and to see what he looked like afterwards." "You can't know that." "I think I can." "But why? What would be the point?" "I'm not sure, but I'm going to try and find out. And you think the Jagos can help you?" "Maybe. I have to start somewhere." "You don't have to start. It's not compulsory." "No. Well, I'll tell you this, Pam. It certainly feels as if it is. Uncle Joshua never spoke openly of his years in North America. The most detailed information I ever had out of him was when he found me looking at a map of Alaska and the Yukon Territory of Canada one day. It was in a big old atlas in the library of Trudeau's house. He brought most of the books in the room from Lady Penscaville as a job lot, as a way of filling the shelves. I assume, since you had never have called him a literary man. But maps he seems to like. Maybe they reminded him of the wandering life. He must have answered some need in his soul, otherwise he wouldn't have followed it for so long. And not surprising, the atlas always seems to fall open at that particular page. Junior, Sitka, Skagway, Whitehorse, and Dawson City, Valdez, Fairbanks, Nome. He knew them all. That was obvious from the way he spoke about them. He had his memories of the tented city on the beach at Nome, where gold sparkled in the black sand of the Bering Sea, of the mud-steep streets and the smoke-filled saloons of Dawson, of the smokestacks and aerial tramways of the Treadwell gold mine stretching along the shore of Douglas Island across the channel from Geneva. So big it was a town unto itself. Of the long sunless winters, when the snow drifted higher than the houses and the temperature dropped to 50 below, and of the short nightless summers, when the flies and mosquitoes could literally drive a man mad. He spoke of such things after and more freely and fully than any other time. I don't know why. Maybe my curiosity in his nostalgia for the land that had been his second home piqued simultaneously by pure chance. It was a day in the early spring of 1947, cold enough to remind him of Alaska, a day in the last spring he ever saw. Fairbanks, deep in the Alaskan interior, was the place he said most about. He spent more time there than anywhere else. Years, it seems. He talked of it when it was just a scat of tents and log cabins, but also of when it was a large and bustling town, laid waste by fire one year, but rebuilt the next. He described the annual sweepstakes on the date the ice would melt in the Chena River. He recounted the celebrations that greeted the news of Congress granted Alaska the right to self-government, and he mentioned an organization I knew nothing about, the Northern Commercial Company. I absorbed these names and events with the wonder and lack of understanding of the child I was. After his death, when the true scale of his wealth became apparent, I borrowed every book about Canadian and Alaskan history that True Republic Library had. There weren't many, but from what I gleaned, enough to put some flesh on the skeleton of his past, to trace the outline of life he led during his 23-year exile from Cornwall. Mum and Dad disapproved of my interest in the subject. They said it was disrespectful of the dead. Even then I knew that was eyewash. With secretive zeal I went on, while other boys were collecting stamps and birds' eggs and cigarette cards. More than once I wish I had Nicky to impress with my discoveries, but that wish had to be protected with even greater secrecy than my historical researches. Joshua Carnaworth left Cornwall in the autumn of 1877, bound, like thousands of other optimistic fortune seekers around the world, for the Klondike goldfield. That's a fact. The rest is my reconstruction of what he must have done, but it's so close to the truth as we're ever likely to get. Anybody who came as late as Uncle Joshua to the Klondike was bound to be disappointed. Graham was right on that score. The goldfield was compact and accessible if you were lucky enough to be there at the start, but that was in 1896-97. If, like Joshua Carnaworth and countless others, you were still working your way up to the coast of British Columbia in the spring of 1898, you were chasing a wild goose, not a golden one, and the chase was hard and long. You reached Skagway, a ramshackle, crime-ridden port just over the Alaskan border. If you weren't robbed or murdered, there was a mud-smeared plank walk. You headed north across the mountains via the notoriously heartbreaking Chilkoot Pass to the Canadian border. You repeated the journey as many times as it took to stockpile the year's supply food with the Mounties insisted you had before entering Canada. Then you trudge on to Lake Bennett and scramble for a berth on a riverboat up to Dawson. And when you get there, you rapidly realise that there wasn't even a living, never mind a fortune, waiting for you. In the summer of 1898, 20,000 people, Joshua Carnaworth among them, confronted each other and their collective folly in the muddy streets of Dawson City. The Mounties ensured they were at least safer than they'd been in Skagway, but rich they weren't, not ever likely to be. The gold was all gone, all spoken for, and butter was in short supply. Uncle Joshua must have despaired, realizing he'd come halfway around the world to gain nothing but an insight into his own stupidity. What was he to do? The question answered itself that winter when word reached Dawson of a bigger, better gold strike at Nome on the far west coast of Alaska. The stampeders were off again in mad pursuit, sledging or walking down 2,000 miles of frozen river. Uncle Joshua went too, on foot, I reckon. If he did have money, it wouldn't have been enough to buy a sledge or dogs to pull it. Maybe he knew by then that it was hopeless, that as soon as he heard of a strike, it was already too late to profit from it. But there was no alternative. He had to follow the course he set. Nome was in fact kinder than most goldfield to the small timer. The metal was right there for the planning. Laced through the sand along the beach, there was no premium on expensive machinery, but as elsewhere, priority counted for everything. The best claims were taken by the spring of 1899. For the rest, there was gold to be had, but not enough, and certainly not quick enough to yield a fortune. Uncle Joshua must have crossed from alternative hope and despair into hard new realism on the tented foreshore of at Nome that last summer of the century. You could shift a living of thoughts from the sand, but if you reckon up the profit and loss, you came out scarcely better than even 2 of the 3 years Cordelia had granted him were up, and it was obvious the last of them wasn't going to be any better. It was over, finished with. The gamble was lost. What did he do? Here the evidence becomes sketchier. I think he realized his only chance of making good was to learn the craft of gold prospecting and to apply the knowledge in areas where none had so far been found, but where there was some reason, however slender, to believe it might be. If so, he must also have realized that the effort would take years and still go unrewarded, but I think he preferred that to creeping home destitute and defeated. How he set about it, I don't know. His familiarity with Judea and the Treadwell mines suggests that he might have worked in them to raise funds for the grand effort. As an experienced miner, it would have been a logical recourse when he left Nome, even poorer than he'd left Dawson. He may have laboured there, salted away his wages for a year or more. Then Fairbanks, the strike there broke the gold rush trend because most of the gold lay inaccessibly deep. It took time and heavy machinery to exploit its potential, so the town of Fairbanks grew as a stable, forward-looking community, spared the worst excess of booms and busts. Uncle Joshua made it his home for the rest of his time in Alaska, and that decision made his fortune. I think he was in from the start, July 1902, when an Italian prospector named Felix Pedro struck gold near a trading post that was off Fairbanks, was then on the Chino River. I think he may even have been in partnership with Pedro. I remember Grant speaking scornfully once in Uncle Joshua's hearing of the Italian prisoners of war the Jogos had been meant to help with the harvest. The old man had flown to the defense, describing the Italians as good and honourable people. I didn't know then that it might have been Felix Pedro he was really thinking of. Uncle Joshua remembered Fairbanks when its permanent structures could be counted on the fingers of one hand, which means he must have been there that first summer. He remembered the town's great fire, which swept through the business district in May 1906, and he remembered news reaching the town of President Taft signing the Alaskan Home Rule Bill in August 1912. I think it's safe to assume he was there continuously from 1902 until the outbreak of the First World War, slowly accumulating a fortune from what must have been highly lucrative mining interests. The Fairbanks region produced $63 million worth of gold between 1902 and 1914, a statistic that stuck in my mind ever since I first came across it. Uncle Joshua presumably formed a company to administer production of at his mines. Maybe he also had a stake in the Northern Commercial Company, the outfit he mentioned to me. The NCC established a virtual monopoly on road and river transport to the coast and supplied the town with water, electricity and steam heating. Maybe he invested in some of Fairbanks' other industries as well, like brewing and logging, and made generous donations to schools and hospitals. Maybe he became a pillar of the community and decided to settle there permanently, helping civic values to establish themselves to the Alaskan heartland. For what it's worth, I believe he's had ended his days in Fairbanks, nourishing his memories of Cordelia, yet reconciled to never see her again, but for the war. There was a phase of his life he never once discussed. The 4 years he spent on the Canadian Army, fighting on the Western Front. Some patriotic instinct must have prompted him to leave Fairbanks and volunteer service to the military authorities in Canada. He had plenty of good reason to stay put in Alaska. He was over 40, and documents that came to light after his death showed he'd already been an American citizen for more than 10 years, but still he went. Grant found some campaign medals and frayed epaulets in an old tobacco tin when she was clearing out his effects. It's only because of them that I know he was a major in the Royal Canadian Engineers. His mining experience probably meant he was a valuable recruit. Maybe he oversaw trench construction and tunneling operation. We'll never know because he never said so much a word. The only certainty is that he emerged from the conflict with mind and body intact. Unlike Cordelia's husband, Archie Lanyon, who ended his war with a German bullet lodged in his brain, an injury that was to prove all the crueler for not being fatal. Uncle Joshua knew nothing of that. When he was demobilised. Even so, something had changed in him. He wanted to go home, and home it seemed meant Cornwall. The death and destruction he'd seen in France must have made him yearn for the land where his life had begun. I suppose he went to Fairbanks to sell off his business interests and settle his affair. That would explain why he didn't reach England until the spring of 1920 and had only liquid assets with him when he did. Assets on a scale that must have shocked the manager of minor banks in Truro when he made it clear just how much he meant to deposit with him. The fact was that Joshua Carnworth had returned to the city of his birth a millionaire several times over. I felt a haunting affinity with Uncle Joshua in the distant hours of his homecoming as I drove out of Truro late that afternoon. There's a point at which absence becomes its own sustenance. Beyond that point, any return to the place and people you've abandoned become impossible. Not in the physical sense, of course. You can go back, but only to discover that what you remember is no longer there. I was heading for the Jagos farm down on the Roseland Peninsula, following the same route as in August 1946 when my father had driven Mickey and me down to Treslick is in the grocery van and seen us onto the King Harry ferry, satisfied that Dennis Jago, Nicky's uncle, was waiting for us with a dog cart on the other side of the river. Petrol was rationing then. Holiday makers in cars hadn't been seen since 1939, which meant never in my recollection, and horse-drawn traffic was commonplace. The ferry was an aging steam-powered craft that looked as if it had been in operation since before the internal combustion engine was invented. Travelling on it without adult supervision, even if we were under observation from both banks, was a great adventure. As the ferry limped across, I stared over the rail at the three tree-lined windings of the river, imagining a galleon in full sail gliding up from Falmouth in times gone by, or smugglers stealing out by night on secret errands. Something of that childish wonder was still with me as I approached the ferry that afternoon. It was a sunny Sunday afternoon, and I wasn't surprised to find a queue winding back up the hill as Treslicks. I had to sit out one crossing before getting aboard. It might well have been quicker to drive the long way around through Tregony, but I didn't care. The thickly wooded banks of the Fall, as it stretched languidly towards Carrick roads, hold more association for me than I could tire in a whole day of waiting. When I reached the other side, I took the St. Maur's road, letting my memories soak in with the heat of the sun and the familiar green folds of the fields and hedges. No vehicle followed me when I turned off down the deep fern-shuttered lane. It had been less overgrown in 1946 on account of wartime traffic to and from a nearby anti-aircraft battery, but the sign at the end of the track led to Nanswerthal was exactly as I remembered it, sagging on its post at what seemed the very same angle. It passed a half-built brick structure visible through a gap in the hedge. The grass was nearly as high as its walls suggested its construction had been abandoned a long time ago. That was the only change I noticed as I approached the house, tucked beneath the brow of the hill, just when the land began to descend towards the cliff top. The fences looked in good order, the cattle in the fields healthy and numerous. When I pulled into the yard, though, I noticed a Dutch barn that hadn't been there in the 40s, and a bigger, more modern milking parlour. Nanswerthal had moved on, if not exactly with the times. There was a dog already snapping around the car when I climbed out. I heard Ethel call it to heel before I saw her watching me from the door of the Cobb and Slate farmhouse. She was about 65, but looked older in a frayed brown dress and green cardigan, her hair lank and grey as a winter's dust, her eyes dimmed by a surfeit of misfortune. I was suddenly lost for words, capable of nothing beyond a smile and a vague gesture of the hands offered sympathy without consolation. "Hello, Ethel," I said, sensing the incongruity of the greeting. I never addressed her by her first name before. "Hello, young Christian." Her Cornish accent surprised me. I'd forgotten how strong it was. Reckon as how it was you. Have you heard from the police? We've been told about Nicky, if that's what you mean. I'm sorry, I wanted to. Can I come in? Come in and welcome. There's tea in the pot. I followed her down the passage and into the kitchen. It would have been cleaner and better aired in former times. The grimy range and unwashed dishes stacked in the sink implied it wasn't just her own appearance she ceased to care about. She'd been a bright-eyed 30-year-old back in 1946 with a glossy brown hair and a bubbly laugh. But she had a son and a sister and a nephew then, and her brother-in-law hadn't been hanged for murder. Ceasing to care was probably about the only way she could have survived. She poured me some tea and we sat down at the table. I drank in silence for a minute, aware of her studying me. Then she said, "I got no saffron buns for you." I nearly choked, remembering how freshly baked saffron buns had been waiting for us in the room every afternoon when Nicky and I returned from some scramble around the field end, swinging little Tommy between us. How I'd looked forward to our promised week at Lansworthal the following summer, but it hadn't happened. This was my next visit more than 30 years later. I was really sorry to hear about Tommy. You saw his bungalow down the lane. What, half-built? That's it. No sense finishing. It was there. 'Twas meant for him, planning to get married, see. Nice party she was too. How long ago was this? 7 years, I sighed. How's Dennis? He's out on the fields. Don't trust himself to do much but work these days. When they told us about Nicky, he just nodded and went back out. He's either like that or he gets so angry with me. She shook her head. What's a boy to do? You don't expect it, do you? Not just to lose so young. Nicky said his mother had died recently. March it was when Rose went. A mercy, really. She was that ill. Where was she living? Essex. They didn't stop when they left here till they got to the east coast and could run no further. She caught my eye. They all felt hounded then and later. What did they do? I mean, Rose married again. Fella caused considering some sort of electrician. And old Mrs. Lanyon, Cordelia died within a 12-month of leaving through cancer. Like Rose or heartbreak, take it as you please. Was Nicky living with his mother when she died? She was living with him, little flat in Clampton. Left her husband last year, wanted to die with one as loved her proper, I dare say. That Considine never was a bit of good to her, always wanted to rattle the bucket and run. So Nicky was left on his own after Rose died. That he was. No family of his own, never married, if that's what you mean, never settled to nothing, didn't Nicky? She gazed stealthily into her tea. What happened to his father? He couldn't get the other side of that. It was always in his mind. Did you see a lot of him? Less and less as he grew older. Rose tell me what he was about in her letters, of course, but they weren't much. Seemingly had a job in the public library in Clacton for a long time. Gave it up so he could nurse his mother since she died. Well, then I went up for the funeral. I saw the change in him, turned in on himself, living more and more in the past, and this family past is no fit place to dwell on, is it? What was the last time you saw him? No, he came here last week, see, and how he was made me feel the worst when I heard. I weren't so very surprised. You could tell he weren't right. So where you sat now, he'd been on the road a while, I reckon. Clothes all lamped and he looked so tired. I asked him to stay with us, but he wouldn't hear of it. Said as he had somewhere else to go, and I reckon he did. But you'll not find it on my mat. She turned away and dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief she plucked from the sleeves of her cardigan. There was a thickness to her voice when she added, "Let's hope he is happier there." I spoke to him yesterday afternoon, I said, unsure how much of our conversation was to reveal. He seemed preoccupied with his father's death. Like I told you, he's never could let go of that. He asked me who killed him. She gave him a long, thoughtful look. What did you tell him? What could I tell him? She pushed out her lower lip and shook her head in answer, then gathered herself in a chair and glanced up to the clock. Dennis, he'll be bringing them in directly for milking. Best move your car, I'm thinking. I sensed she wanted to find a reason to be rid of me, that whether she was worried about letting her tongue run with her, or how Dennis might react to my presence, I couldn't tell. I must be going anyway, I said, finishing my tea at gulp as I stood up. I only came well, you know. She looked at me. Yes, reckon as I do. Can you let me know when the funeral to be? I'd like to attend if I may. I'll do that for you, Christian. You can contact me at the Chow House, or they'll pass a message. Your sister's made a handsome job of running that place. Yes, I think she has. The remark drew my thoughts back to Nicky and the past he'd dwelled in over long. Perhaps if Nicky's sister had lived, there might have been somebody too. Well, I don't know. give him some support when he needed it. He mentioned her yesterday, strange enough, so long ago, and he mentioned his sister. Ethel frowned at me. Yes, he did. I thought it odd at the time. After all, she had been dead for years. Who's to say she's dead? Ethel frown was turning hostile. I fronted somehow. Sorry. Rose talked herself into believing she was dead, and I suppose Nicky went along with her until he believed it too, but nobody can be sure. I stared at her in amazement. I don't understand. Frida died of whooping cough, didn't she? Oh, Frida did, yes, she coloured. I see what you mean. Hurriedly, she stood up and moved towards the door. I'd best see you out before the cows stove up your car. Hold on a second. Ago, you said nobody could be sure. What do you mean? Nothing, it's just... She looked at me, pleading. It seemed not to be pressed. I didn't rightly understand. What didn't you understand? Which... She looked away. Which sister you meant? But there was only one, wasn't there? No, Rose had another daughter, see. After they moved to Essex, what happened to her? Disappeared one day on her way home from school about 15 years ago, vanished without a trace. Rose convinced herself she was dead, but nobody was ever found. Nobody was ever found. She could be alive to this day, and should be Nicky's half-sister. No, they were brother and sister, fair and square. I still don't understand. Surely if Rose had a daughter by this man Considine, Mike Michaela was born before Rose even met that Whitneck. Michaela? Before he could respond, I guess what the name was signifying. You mean she was Michael Langdon's child, born posthumously? Ethel hesitated for a moment, then nodded in solemn confirmation. Good God, yes, her eyes held mine, but sometimes I wonder if he is so very good when I look at what he allows. Thanks for listening.